Would you like to be an MP?
No, not at all, no.
OK, well, let's carry on as bloggers then, should we, instead? And I'll put that script in the bin. So what do you think about how it went over the last few days?
Well, I think it is appropriate that Maria Miller has resigned. I think it's extraordinary that it took so long to happen. Conservative Grassroots, an organisation which I run, did a poll on Monday that showed that only 15% of people support the Prime Minister's decision to support Maria Miller, and that actually it's mainly Conservative voters and supporters that want to see her resign more than anyone else. So I think for the Conservative Party and for citizens across the country, I think they're very glad that this happened, but it took too long, and that has damaged certainly David Cameron, if not the Conservative Party as well.
Do you agree, Mark?
Well, I think that the simple fact is that David Cameron has taken too long over this. Unfortunately, there's a pattern which seems to come about in that his loyalty to his team is an admirable thing, but often loyalty taken too far can become a weakness. And evidently, sometime around the end of last week, they decided that possibly Maria Miller could be saved, so they should throw the kitchen sink at it. Unfortunately, days went by, more headlines came out, more harm was done to Conservative MPs, local council and European candidates on the doorstep trying to talk about why to vote Tory, and ultimately this dragged on for far too long before she was asked to go.
Ben, why do you think that Labour didn't make more of it? We were talking about this in the last hour, and I made the point to our contributors then, neither of those who were MPs either, who were suggesting that actually there's a lot of dirty washing in the Labour Party, although Mr Miliband is squeaky clean when it comes to his expenses.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are most angry about this. They're angry about Maria Miller, how she handled the situation personally, but they're also angry about the fact that the system still doesn't make sense. I mean, there are still extraordinary things like the ability of MPs to designate one property as their primary residence for tax purposes and a different property as their primary residence for the claim of expenses, which Maria Miller did, but a lot of other people did too. And so I think this is a real, Westminster not being in touch with the country at large issue. It's not just about Maria Miller; it's about more than that. And a poll that we did on Monday, as I mentioned, also found that 60% of people feel that Maria Miller is representative of a wider political cast that stretches across all of the three major political parties that I think the public have frankly had enough of.
Do you agree, Mark, the fact that the public perception of politicians has been even further damaged when it comes to talking about expenses? Who would have thought that could have happened?
Well, indeed, just when you think the reputation of Westminster and politics has sunk as low as it can go, something like this happens. And I'm afraid we may well not have seen the end of it. It seems that it's very possible the Telegraph may well reopen their files from the original scandal in 2009. There are plenty of MPs in Parliament from that time who got off relatively lightly, some for doing much worse than Maria Miller, simply because they were lucky with the news cycle when their receipts were released. I think the key thing to realise is that there are MPs who are being unfairly treated here as well. The 2010 intake in particular, who came into Parliament on the back of the MP's expenses scandal, they campaigned on the basis of helping to clean up Westminster. They're furious that something like this has happened and tarred them with the same brush, and it was really in particular them calling for Maria Miller to go. There's reports today that they were forwarding on constituency emails and letters to Downing Street saying, look at this, how am I meant to answer this with my voters? And so I do think we're seeing a generational change in Westminster for the better.
Ben, do you think it really is about expenses, though, or do you think it's about arrogance and the 32-second apology, in inverted commas, in the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister saying, I'm just going to back her completely? Ben?
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of truth in that. As I say, I think if everyone makes mistakes, if Maria Miller had apologised in a genuine way and people believed that she was really sorry and she'd taken steps actually to perhaps pay back the full amount that it was initially deemed that she should pay back by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, which was approximately £45,000, and if people believed that she was genuinely sorry and people believed in her as an individual, that she was someone that could be genuine about the process and that she was actually devastated, then I think this would have been a very different situation. But because of the aloof manner, the perfunctory and the procedural way that she dealt with the whole thing, and seemingly even now doesn't realise why it's a big issue. I think that could be said of not just Maria Miller, but still some people in government that don't realise that people are really, really angry about this. And I think as long as that's the case, that's the bigger issue than individual incidents of expenses being abused.
So what sort of problems do you think it could still cause, Mark, for the Prime Minister, in your opinion?
Well, I think there are a number of difficulties. The first is we saw once Maria Miller was in trouble and the number 10 line to support her was clear, there was an almost complete lack of backbench MPs willing to come out and support her. Now, some of that is because they disagreed with her behaviour over expenses, the 32-second apology that Ben just mentioned and so on. But a big part of it is that they've had their fingers burned in the past. There is a tendency for number 10, unfortunately, in times of crisis to rally backbenchers to the cause, put them on television, talk to journalists like yourself, Kay, say what number 10 wants them to say, and then for there to be a U-turn which leaves people hanging in the breeze. So a lot of MPs, speaking to them in the last few days, simply, even if they were sympathetic, simply weren't willing to stick their necks out. I think we may see that now extend even to PPSs and ministerial aides after Mary McLeod's absolutely car crash afternoon on television yesterday, where, having been put up to do this apparently by the government, she was then hung out to dry, and Maria Miller's special advisor distanced the minister from her own PPS.
I see what you did there, Mark. Ben, what do you think this is going to mean for the European elections?
Well, our polling suggested that about a third of people following the specific incident with Maria Miller that voted Conservative in 2010 would now be less likely to do so in the 2014 and 2015 general elections. But that's as it stands now. I don't think the situation is insurmountable. And one positive that's come out of this is there's been a lot of voices calling for greater reform. And voices like Zach Goldsmith's also calling for the right of recall and greater democracy to be driven through the country. I think if voices like that start being heard more and start being associated more with the Conservative Party, then actually a lot of this damage the political damage can be undone, and we can get a better democracy, better parliament out of it.
What do you make of suggestions of recall? Up until now, Mark, up until now, it has really just been Mr. Goldsmith who's been pushing for it, or are there others as well?
Well, I think there's actually quite a wide coalition of people who support this. There are certainly a lot of MPs who are interested in the idea, particularly as it's clear, even clearer now, that the boil of expenses has not been lanced, the poison hasn't been drained from this issue whatsoever by the reforms that Parliament hastily implemented in 2009 and then introduced a little bit later on as well. Certainly you see groups like the Taxpayers Alliance, who I used to work for, have been campaigning for recall from the outset of the expenses scandal, and I suspect we'll hear a lot more about it. The important thing is that what comes out of this is, firstly, the Conservative Party and the government can get back on to making the positive case about the real success stories, the news like the IMF reporting on the growth in new record levels of growth in the economy, other developments in terms of new jobs and so on. But also, when we talk about expenses, it needs to be in terms of sorting it out, not just backbiting and infighting about it. So things like recall, to me, seem like an extremely positive way forward to give the people a real chance to sack MPs who they think have misbehaved, instead of having MPs marking their own homework.
OK, great to talk to you both, Ben Harris-Quinney and Mark Wallace. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon here on Sky News. Still to come for you.